People often ask me what I do, and I say, well, I do some kind of combination of public policy, politics, government, philanthropy, and business. I got it all started, of course, from my family in a very small town in Minnesota, a town of 3,000 people. My father had 8 brothers and sisters who lived all their life in this little town. This is 613 11th Street South. Behind is 615 11th Street South. And from 3 days old until 17 and a half years later, I lived in one of these 2 houses. And this was the family neighborhood. Within 2 blocks in any direction here, there are 14 houses that were lived in by aunts, uncles, and cousins. So the notion of it takes a village was much older than the current phrase. I didn't know it was small when I was growing up. 3,000 people, 3,100 I think in the census of 1950, and there's a sign on the way into town saying, "Welcome to Benson, Minnesota, home of 4,000 friendly people." People in town used to say to each other, that makes us slightly larger than New York City. If we got 4,000 friendly ones here, they can't compete. And so we loved it.
Benson has grown through the years as a city, while the county has dropped in population as there are fewer farms out there, as there are fewer rural residents. Families have gone from 6 to 7 kids to 2 or 3 kids. And we see it reflected in our schools. When Jim attended Benson High School down the street, there were nearly 2,000 students in the Benson school system. Today there's about 800 students in the school system.
It was a religiously oriented community. So every Sunday, from the time I was able to walk, certainly, till the time I left for college, I was either at the earlier version of this church or at this church, and my parents were here every Sunday. And it was such a major factor in my life. I sang in the church choir, I went to Sunday school. It was part of the fabric of the community. It wasn't oppressive in any way. It was a tolerant version of Lutheranism. It was an accepting, embracing kind of religion, and it fit with my dad and my mom's preferences for the kind of values they wanted us to have. I started playing golf here when I was 8 years old because my dad, my mother, and my sister all loved golf.
And it was Alfred I. Johnson who was responsible for the city ownership of the golf course in many ways. And then he went on to become the president of the golf course. And it was that love and tie to the golf course that his son Jim adopted as he was growing up and has carried through his life.
I went onto the high school golf team in the 7th grade. I was the last man on the team as a 7th grader, and captain, of course, by the time I became a senior. And this green behind me has a particular significance because my senior year in high school, right after I graduated from high school, I won the Benson Club Championship on this hole. I feel like I have been unbelievably blessed. The most fabulous family, the most fabulous opportunities, the most fabulous springboard to leave here and be ready for the world. I'd barely read a book when I left. I went to the University of Minnesota, but I had been coached and brought up in a way that a month after I got to the University of Minnesota, I was elected president of the freshman cabinet. I became preoccupied with opportunity from the very beginning, and that is give everybody a chance. Don't hold them down. Don't push them back. Don't push them down. Let the whole world reach its potential. Reaching the potential of each individual human being, I would say, was the central thought in this neighborhood. Well, my father did a lot of things as well. He was a businessman. He started out working as a baker in a bakery when he was in his teenage years, started at the bottom of the bottom. He was born in 1898, He was a graduate of the 8th grade in 1911, where he went half in Norwegian and half in English to get his education. And he then proceeded to be the Speaker of the House of Minnesota. He was on the Board of Regents of the University of Minnesota. He was the #1 education advocate for the state of Minnesota. He was the state representative of our little county, Swift County, from 1940 to 1958. And he was always there when I was growing up. I had great admiration for his resiliency and for his commitment to hard work. But the one thing about his parenting was that he was a hands-off parent. He was in the house always. He was in town when he wasn't at the state legislature. And I don't ever remember him asking me what grade I got in some class in high school. I don't ever remember him telling me to do something. He was 46 when I was born. He started treating me like an adult when I was about 5. You could always count on him to be there in a soft, quiet, supportive way, but not necessarily in the auditorium screaming and applauding. He was a quiet man when he wasn't at the podium, in which case he was a good speaker. He was just a man who had civic concern, political and public policy conviction, a good business sense, and he was able to be flexible and clever about how he moved back and forth among the various things. And I just love the fact that he became the #1 supporter of the University of Minnesota, became the #1 education advocate in the Minnesota State Legislature with an 8th grade education. We're in the A.I. Johnson Great Room at the University of Minnesota, which was named after my father. So for many, many years, he stood up for opportunity for all Minnesotans and all people to get a good education. One time he had a proposal for a scholarship program for C students. And I said, "Dad, isn't that a little strange?" And he said, "Yes, it's a little strange." He said, "On the other hand, the A students and the B students are not going to drop out. They'll be fine. They can work while they're going to school. The C students are probably going to need all the attention they can get on their studies. So let's make it possible for them to have more flexibility to succeed." When I hear that something is being held, a new regent announced, or a new professor announced, or a new National Science Award announced, or a Rhodes Scholarship announced, they announced it from the A.I. Johnson room. I think it was a great development in his memory. Alfred I. Johnson made a remarkable contribution to the state of Minnesota. He was a human being of great warmth, good humor, unchallenged integrity, and solid convictions. Alfred I. Johnson, above all, committed his public life to providing opportunity to all. Opportunity for quality education was his chosen vehicle. As I left for the university at age 17, I didn't really have any idea what I was going to do, but I went from a town of 3,000 to a campus of 33,000. And within about 2 weeks, I was elected president of the freshman cabinet. Within a year and a half, I was elected student body president. Within 2.5 years, I was the chairman of the supervisory board of the National Student Association. I became then head of the Student Body Presidents Association. And so student politics and public policy all of a sudden was right in the center of who I was and what I was doing. All of my late adolescence and early adult life, I was preoccupied with watching what was going on in the South on voting rights. I heard the announcement of the Selma to Montgomery March, and I asked 2 friends of mine if they wanted to drive to Alabama with me. And so the 3 of us, we drove to Selma from Minneapolis. Then on the second to last day of the march, we drove from Selma into something called the City of St. Jude. I was always a little on the formal side. So I was wearing a gray suit. My colleagues were dressed roughly similarly. And we started walking into Montgomery, and there were a lot of old style bungalows with front porches. And there were a lot of young guys with t-shirts on and cigarettes rolled up in their sleeves and so on, which in Minnesota we would call hoodlums, because we didn't have real hoodlums. We had just people who didn't look right. As we went by, the three of us, it was a mixture of black and white marchers around where we were, thousands of people. What they yelled at us, you will never guess. White trash. And we looked at each other, we said, of all the things that might be on our self-image list, white trash is not one of them. And then we were there right in front of the Martin Luther King's church, which is right on the approach to the Capitol, and listened to the whole extravaganza, and the whole thing made a huge impression on me.
He first came into my life as a young student who came to Atlanta, where I was working as a civil rights worker involved in the Southern Regional Council, and Jim Johnson showed up. And it was clear that here was a young man from Minnesota who had a deep, genuine interest in the civil rights movement and making life better for all Americans.
When it came time to figure out kind of what I was doing, I went on the faculty at Princeton for a little while, for about a year and a half technically, although at part of that time I was actually out campaigning for Senator McCarthy in 1968. The McCarthy campaign was run by a bunch of friends of mine from the National Student Association. This fellow comes to town named Allard Lowenstein, who was quite well known in those days, a real liberal activist. And he said, I want you to invite me to Princeton University, give me the best auditorium on campus, and let me give a speech there in early November about why it's essential that we dump President Johnson. So I set it up, and Allard came up. We had a good crowd, and he went on and on and on about the war and about Johnson, about how he wasn't the right president for this country at that time. And somebody said, I've got a question, Mr. Lowenstein. How can you beat somebody with nobody? Who's your candidate? And so Lowenstein then, without missing a beat, he said it's Mick something from the Midwest, meaning McGovern or McCarthy. And about 3 weeks later, they talked McCarthy into running. Allard's friends of mine, were sent to New Hampshire to run the race. They asked me many times to come up. I was a student basically at that time, but interested in politics. And I said, no, I'm not going to do that. This is hopeless. You're not going to dump a sitting president, with a senator from Minnesota who no one's ever heard of. They said, okay. And so the day after the New Hampshire primary, I called Curtis Gans, who was the national campaign manager for McCarthy, who I had known for many years, and I said, okay, you were right, I was wrong, where do I go next? He said, you're going to Wisconsin, you're going to take about 10 or 15 people with you, and you're going to run the northwest part of the state. So that was my first political experience. I went from there to working for President McCarthy, of course, President Muskie, President McGovern, all the people who lose, I worked for. And then I worked for Walter Mondale. He asked me to go to the convention with him in '76 when he was asked to be Jimmy Carter's running mate. My friend Holbrook was called one day by a guy named Tom Farmer. Farmer calls Holbrook and he says, I was talking to Mondale last night over the back fence, and Mondale needs a new senior political guy to work with him on the re-election campaign. I was working for McGovern at the time. Tom Farmer said to Holbrook, do you know anybody? He said, well, how would you like to have somebody from Minnesota, whose dad was in Minnesota politics, who's a professor at Princeton, who's worked in 5 previous presidential campaigns, and who would probably be thrilled to do it. And so Mondale says to Farmer, who the hell is that? Right? And he said, Jim Johnson, son of A.I. Johnson. So Mondale's assistant called me and said, would you be willing to have breakfast with the senator? I said, of course. And so I went up to the Senate dining room, and he all but offered me a job on first meeting. And this is really the first time we'd ever had a talk that was remotely personal, that was remotely either business or personal.
I knew about Jim. He was one of the stars in that part of the state. He was, I think, a student at Princeton. Not too many people out there went to Princeton. We had basically the same beliefs, same framework, same idea of reform. He came out of that Norwegian community in in western Minnesota. I came out of the same environment down in southern Minnesota, and I think we knew, though we hadn't met, we knew each other. We knew what made us tick. And so, and of course I knew his dad, and so when we talked about things, there wasn't much mystery about how much we agreed on things. It was a question of how we could fit, and I sort of sensed that Jim was willing to do it. He wasn't playing cute. We put it together and off we went. There's a little town in Norway called Mondale, and that's where my family grew up, and Jim's great-grandmother grew up about 12 miles away. That shows you how close all of this stuff is.
The evolution of the vice presidency started when Mondale went to Plains in the summer of '76. He and Carter instantly got along well. Rosalind and Joan instantly got along well. And from the first time they met and talked about the vice presidency, Carter imagined the potential for a real partnership. And then Jimmy Carter was the one basically who took the lead on saying a new kind of vice presidency.
So we wrote this memo, which is now almost like a basic law, which described what a vice president would do, and Carter signed off on it. He said, "That's exactly what I want to do," and that made the vice president a chief advisor to the president. The great bane of the vice president over history is that the president looks at him and is reminded of his mortality. He knows that guy is thinking, well, I'll only be president if you're not here. It's a kind of a toxic environment, and Carter would have none of it. In fact, he told me, he said, I don't worry about death. That's God's decision. And what I do worry about is having an effective administration, and I'd like to use you. I wouldn't want you, and I think you can help me in ways that no one else can. You get spanked in Minnesota for being proud, so I'm not proud. It's now, 40 years, and every vice presidential team since then of both political parties have adopted the same idea, the details different, but the idea of moving the vice president in as a key figure in the White House, close to the president, remains the key element.
I think Mondale's vice presidency really was transformative in the way people perceived the vice presidency, a sense of partnership with the president. I think the kinds of roles, the location was a very, very big deal. Just the proximity, the walk down the hall from the Oval Office, the kind of sense of shared responsibility and partnership in the role.
I built a little cubbyhole of an office outside Mondale's office for myself, and all the rest of the staff, aside from 2 or 3 secretaries, were over in the old executive office building, which Mondale then termed in a way that nobody liked, except me. I thought it was funny. He said he always referred to the old executive office building where all of his staff was as Baltimore, as in, you may as well be in Baltimore right, if you're not in the West Wing. And he and I were the only 2 in the West Wing. And so I sat in on every meeting, for 4 years, every trip, every mile, hundreds of thousands of miles, and had an unbelievable gift of an experience from him. And I'm forever grateful to Walter Mondale.
Jim's very bright, but more than that, what interested me was he wanted to make changes now in America, reform America now, and that's exactly what I was like. I was nervous, I wanted to get going, I wanted to change things, and we made a natural partnership. Off we went.
We were on the road together for hundreds of thousands of miles. And and as you go through the day, sometimes he'd have 3 or 4 news conferences, and he'd be asked questions, and you'd have to evolve the answer. And so we'd be sitting on the plane there with 2 or 3 other people, where we'd be trying out the answer, particularly if at the last stop it didn't work. But in many cases, I was the one who was putting together what he needed to know from other people. And we had a very good, very high quality staff. A lot of the people who'd worked with him in the Senate. Carter made it possible for a Mondale person to become the Deputy National Security Advisor and the Deputy Domestic Policy Advisor. So we had one of our people in each of the major segments of the White House who'd been on the Senate staff. And so who knew Mondale, who knew us, who worked with us. Mondale and Dole, who knew each other from the Senate, were put on the national stage with over 80 million viewers to talk through and fight out who had a better position on the key issues of the 1976 elections. They went back and forth on a number of things. The moment I would always think about is something that became extremely famous, and that is that Bob Dole accused Mondale of supporting Democrat wars. Democrat wars, in Dole's definition, included World War II, the Korean War. You know, we thought they were American wars. We thought they were Republican and Democrats' wars. And so when he came forward with the Democrat wars, everybody went berserk.
It is an appropriate topic, I guess, but it's not a very good issue any more than the war in Vietnam would be, or World War II, or World War I, or the war in Korea. All Democrat wars, all in this century.
Does he really mean to suggest to the American people that there was a partisan difference over our involvement in the war to fight Nazi Germany? I don't think any reasonable American would accept that.
We then, apropos planning ahead and thinking ahead, executing well. So when you see political crowds, they always come from somewhere. That is, lots of phone calls, lots of flyers, lots of invites, an existing crowd, whatever. And so we went to Wichita the morning after the LA Theater and had a huge crowd because I decided with my friend Mike Berman and a couple others that whatever happened in a debate, we had to be unbelievably pleased with the outcome. And so we bought a crowd in Wichita. That is, we spent a lot more money than usual, radio advertising, telephone banks. So we had a huge crowd in Wichita when Mondale arrived. And then it turned out, of course, that Dole from Kansas had given us that line about Democrat wars, and it was a turning point in the campaign. I think he felt like I knew what I knew, and I was pretty frank about what I didn't know. And you know, he's very suspicious of arrogance and very suspicious of people of bullshit. Right? And the fact that I was sort of on the money substantively when I thought I was, and that I wasn't pretending to be on the money when I wasn't, I think gave him a chance to build confidence. The ratification of SALT II and the ratification of the Panama Canal Treaty were extremely high priorities in the Carter-Mondale White House. The ratification of the canal was a very difficult thing. It was a mixed case in terms of the American public, and there were a lot of people who were against, quote unquote, giving away the canal. So we worked senator by senator, because it was a Senate ratification vote, of course. On both occasions, Mondale was used to build editorial support and public opinion on the side of the administration. So we would go out and talk about how SALT II was essential to our national security. We would go out and talk about how Panama Canal was essential to longer-term trade and better relations with the rest of the world. We did probably the single most substantive, important mission. It was December of '78 when we had a normalization with China. The question then was, how do we begin a solid, constructive relationship with people we've had no relationship with for a very long time? There was a big organized effort within the administration to figure out how to get off on the right track with China. And Deng Xiaoping was very much the leader, but it was a new day. And so I was over in Bangkok. My friend Holbrooke was the Assistant Secretary of State for Asia, and he invited me to come and meet with all of the American ambassadors in Asia and to brief them on what had happened in the '78 elections in the US. It turns out that 4 of the people who also came to that meeting were Senator Sam Nunn, Senator John Glenn, Senator Gary Hart, and Senator Bill Cohen. Holbrooke was a brash guy. So he said to Sam Nunn, who was leading the Senate delegation, my friend Jim Johnson's here, I want to put him on your plane, take him to Peking with you. And so I went off then with the 4 senators on their government plane to Peking and met with Deng Xiaoping for hours in the January of '79. There was a controversy as to who was going to take the lead on China. After some considerable back and forth between Brzezinski and Vance, Mondale proposed to the president that he take the lead on the normalization of relationships with China. And we spent months in '79 working on what we could do to get off to a good start. So we arrived in Air Force Two in Peking in August, and there was a colonel and a cleaning person met us at the airport. We went into the city then, and on all the lampposts around the Tiananmen Square and the Great Hall of the People were welcome signs to the King of Nepal. No mention of the Vice President of the United States. Okay, to say there was a little skepticism on the part of the Chinese about this trip was a real understatement. We go in for our first long session. I was sitting 3-4 seats away from Mondale, and he starts presenting. And his presentation is about 97% good news. Essentially things that we knew the Chinese wanted, which we thought were not going to be a problem for us. And we went through it and through it and through it and through it. And we had a second day of meetings in Peking, and then we went to Xi'an. We have 250,000 people that welcome us. So we'd gone from 2 cooks and a bottle washer to 250,000 people in about 48 hours. And it was a huge success. I learned from Walter Mondale that there's nothing about politics that eliminates success for a fabulous person. He was honest, he was straightforward, he had real friends, he had real allies, he told the truth, he was an absolute star as a human being. He was an intellectual force, analytical force, and he was a good politician. I have a joke that I use, and that is that I worked for 10 Democratic presidents. I worked for President Kerry, I worked for President Gore, I worked for President Dukakis, I worked for President Mondale, President McCarthy, McGovern, Muskie, right? But in recent years, what I've done is things that are basically not campaign type things, but vice presidential selection, debate negotiation, transition planning, so that it's not the day-to-day of the campaign struggle. But if they need somebody who's done real work around things they really care about, like getting the debates negotiated correctly in the right places at the right time with the right moderators, with the right agreement on what's going to be discussed, people care. The candidates care a lot about that. And also they care a lot about vice presidential selection.
Jim is respected, and that's too mild a word, in Washington by everyone who knows him for his judgment. He has incredibly good judgment, for his intellect, which is of the first order, and for the contributions he's made culturally, in terms of social and racial justice, in terms of creating in DC a sense of community where you're not just looking out for yourself, you're looking out for everyone.
I think it applies, generally speaking, beyond politics. I mean, a lot of business burns out a lot of people. A lot of nonprofit work burns out people, right? I think the same elements of success are present in all these areas. And that is that you have to have a realistic, more insightful strategy. You have to have conviction and intensity among your supporters. And then you have to deploy resources, just like business, where when it's not going to win, you back off. When you have a chance to win, you pour it on. And the timing and execution turns out to be enormously challenging. So I negotiated the debates a number of times. I did for Mondale with Jim Baker, and I negotiated the debates for Gore, I negotiated the debates for Kerry, and I was asked if I would participate in the debate prep for Senator Lloyd Bentsen when he was running with Dukakis. I said to Bentsen, I've reviewed the research, and the research is solid. Quayle quite often compares himself to Jack Kennedy, and it wouldn't be a surprise if it came up in the debate. I went down to Austin with Bentsen. We did some more practice sessions, and he went to Omaha. Quayle compared himself to Kennedy in the debate, 90 million people watching. Bentsen says, I knew Jack Kennedy. Jack Kennedy was a friend of mine. You're no Jack Kennedy. And the place went berserk.
Senator, I served with Jack Kennedy. I knew Jack Kennedy. Jack Kennedy was a friend of mine. Senator, you're no Jack Kennedy.
The whole country went berserk. And so that's my best debate story.
His role in kind of shaping how we all thought about our lives professionally and how we would participate in this community, this broader Washington community, which is not just folks who are either working on the Hill or serving in the government or working in an administration, but the entire community of people, from folks who work in business and who consult and who participate in all the, the fine arts and the think tanks and the institutions around Washington that most people have enormous respect for and want to be a part of. Jim's really helped everybody else just as a role model and all of that think about how they would do it for themselves.
It is my sense that Jim has always been a constructive person. He has always had a belief in the importance of government, and he's had a belief that good government is achievable and conscientious people should be in government, and young people should certainly consider government as a career or as a contribution or as a brief or as a period in their lives. Well, I think across the board, culturally, politically, socially, Jim Johnson has been a significant factor and contributor to Washington.
Mondale called me into his office and he says, what are you going to do next? And I said, well, I'm not really an academic. I'm not really going to go off leave and go back to Princeton. I've always assumed that I'd probably do something in business. My dad was a businessman. And he said, business where? Oh, I don't know. I'll look for opportunities. I know a lot of people here and there, and I'll start moving around and see what people have. He said, would you be willing to go into business in Minneapolis? And I said, sure, I like Minneapolis. I'd like the university years very much. And so he yelled at his secretary, Linda Jadwin. He said, Linda, get me Bruce Dayton on the phone.
So I called Bruce Dayton. I said, is there any chance that you could find a place for Jim? And I explained it. I think he knew Jim, but I explained it to him. And within an hour, I believe, we had a call from Bruce Dayton asking Jim if he could start the next Monday or something like that. It was fast action.
So that was my business plan, was to go into Mondale's office and be placed in the best business in Minnesota with the #1 family in Minnesota. I served for a total of 105 years on New York Stock Exchange listed American companies, which I've enjoyed tremendously. The board service changes because the three things that directors should be most concerned about have to do with strategy, personnel, governance, and integrity. The two most interesting experiences for me have been Goldman Sachs and Target. Target in part because I'm a Minnesotan. I worked for the company that owned and started Target when I was 28. Dayton Hudson, it was called. One of the Dayton's brothers fought up the idea of doing Target. I am now the oldest employee who's still engaged with Target, even though I haven't worked there for decades and decades. Aside from going on the board in '96, I hadn't worked there since '76.
Most people in business don't understand politics and government, and most businesses are connected to government, whether they like it or not. And so I think one of Jim's great gifts was being a translator, a diplomat, again, eminence grise, understanding the language and the psychology of politics and government, which is a tremendous asset in a boardroom, a tremendous asset in the C-suite, because it takes a business beyond the numbers to people.
The next chapter of my life was about a very large organization called Fannie Mae, which was the most important institution in the American housing finance system and the biggest financial institution in the United States. My association with Fannie Mae began before I knew what it was. A friend of mine named Betty Ann Ottinger, formerly married to a congressman from New York, who was a good friend of mine, called me up and said, "There's somebody I want you to meet because I believe the two of you will be totally compatible." She said, "His name is David Maxwell. He is the chairman and CEO of Fannie Mae." So I said naturally, "What's Fannie Mae?" Never heard of it. And I'd been around and doing all this politics and a little bit of business, but in Minnesota and so on, it just never crossed my path. I was actually on the board of the Minnesota Housing Finance Agency, and it still didn't cross my path. So anyway, I knew nothing about it. David has a big stock offering he wants to do in '87. And he's got Goldman Sachs and Salomon Brothers and Morgan Stanley and everybody circling around trying to get this assignment. So he calls me up one day and he said, "I'm naming you to head the stock offering." So I called the guys in New York at Lehman Brothers and said, "We've just been named to do this big stock offering you've been reading about for Fannie Mae." They said, "You're joking, right?" And I said, "No, I'm not joking. He just called me." I traveled with him then for, I don't know, total of maybe 2.5 weeks overseas in 2 or 3 different trips. And so we get back then, so this is like '87, maybe early '87. And he says, "Jim, I want you to start advising me more closely on Fannie Mae." And I said, I still didn't know anything. And so I said, "Great." He said, "I want you to come to my management meetings. I want you to come to my off-site strategy meetings. And I want you to be there to hear what people are saying and to help me evaluate it." So this is all moving pretty quickly. He calls me up one day and he says, "Come on over." So I go over there and he said, "Jim, I've been thinking." He said, "I don't really have a good successor here. And would you be willing to be my successor as the chairman and CEO of Fannie Mae?" And I had no mortgage background, no banking background. I had a lot of politics, so I had good judgment and so on. And I said, "Well, of course, I'd be honored. It's maybe the best job in America." And he said, "I'll get back to you." 6 months later, calls me, same thing. I go over, half hour later, he says, "Would you still be interested in this job?" And I said, "Of course I would." He said, "Good, I'll get back to you." 6 months later, 6 months later, and 6 months later, he called. The last time he calls on this 6-month cycle, he says, "Come over." And I said, "Fine." And I'd known him even a lot better then because I've been going to all these meetings and retreats and strategy sessions and so on. And I actually knew something about the company. And he said, "Can you leave for Chicago in the morning?" And I said, "Sure. What am I going to do there?" He said, "We're moving tomorrow. I'm going to name you vice chairman of the company tomorrow. There's a board meeting in Chicago. There are 2 directors I want you to meet with before they hear it from me at the board meeting." So this was in September of '89. And he said, "You'll start on January 1, '90. And so I'm there for 6 or 8 months. And he says, "We're ready to move." He said, "I'm going to announce now that you're my successor and that you're going to be chairman and CEO as of January 1 or February 1. And I'll be leaving on February 1 or January 1, whatever we decide when we know more about this." I said, great. And so on February 1 of 1991, I took over as chairman and CEO of this massive company with this massive national footprint. One of the advantages I had came from politics. That is, I knew the country, starting all the way back to those NSA days. In every state in the Union, politics, NSA, civil rights, anti-war, I had some roots basically everywhere in the country. So that was an advantage that he's apparently seen and knew that that would be of value. I'd worked with a ton of different people, unbelievable variety of people. You'd be happy to know at that time about 90% of the mortgage bankers in America were Republicans. But the only thing they loved more than the Republican Party was golf. I was, of course, a big Democrat. And when they learned that I'd been the club champion of my club at age 17, they relaxed. They said, well, at least you can play golf. We don't know much else about it. The housing coalition we built had an unshakable conviction that more home ownership was better for more people and for our country. And we started out our crusade. David had done quite a lot of work on this, of focusing on more new immigrants, more low and moderate income people, more young people, and tried to figure out the mechanisms for putting ownership that would work, mortgages that would succeed in their hands. We did a very aggressive advertising campaign where we spent hundreds of millions of dollars under two different titles. One was Showing America a New Way Home, because there was a broad consensus at that point that owning your own home was an essential part of the American dream. And Roy Spence, who advised me on all this, said to me, he said, Jim, never say you're in the secondary mortgage market. It means nothing to anybody, and it certainly doesn't inspire them. You're in the American dream business.
You're not just building a brighter future for your family. You're building a brighter future for all of us. For a free guide that can help you on the path to home ownership, call the Fannie Mae Foundation.
I went for a mammogram in 93 or 94. And when I got to the mammogram place, Columbia Hospital, now closed, both machines were broken. And the waiting room was filled with people who were from 9 to 5 jobs, who had gotten their 2 hours off to get their mammogram. And suddenly, what were they going to do? Were they going to be able to get it extended? Could they come back another day? Whatever. And that night I was just cooking for Jim and Bob. I was making a very good risotto. And I was waving my risotto spoon around, as I want to do, and I said, I don't know what's happening. I mean, then I said to Jim, well, what happens to the women with you? I mean, you have a lot of women working for you at Fannie Mae. What's happening? And he said, I don't know. So I didn't hear anything from him. And the next week I was driving past Fannie Mae on a Friday, and there was this humongous mammogram bus. And it was there all the time from then on, so that any woman who worked there could simply sign up, not deal with insurance or anything else, get her mammogram done. And then I think the next year or the year after, Jim got a big award for everything he'd done about women's health.
I did an enormous amount of work focusing on housing opportunity for Hispanics and new immigrants, new citizens, when I was at Fannie Mae. And so I had counseling available, and I printed the Fannie Mae counseling guide that we built up to help people figure out whether they should own a house or not. I built it in 32 languages, but the biggest language other than English we published in was Spanish. So a lot of people in the Hispanic community had been watching the work we were doing at Fannie Mae and seeing thousands and thousands of Hispanic families having equal opportunity because they had good counseling and they had good loans and they had good, in some cases, subsidies to get into housing.
Jim has a very deep commitment to social justice and racial justice. He's an honorary degree from Howard University. He felt very strongly about the obligation to open up housing opportunities for minorities. Jim is profoundly motivated by the belief that he can make a difference, and he has, time after time after time. He made an enormous difference at Fannie Mae in terms of opening up housing opportunities. And by the way, he was long gone before the subprime mortgage crisis hit. and sometimes gets unfairly pulled into it.
Howard University was created by the federal government right after, I believe, either right before or right after the Civil War. And it is still a magnificent place. And so I was asked by the president of Howard, when I was at Fannie Mae, if I would throw the full force of Fannie Mae, the leading force in housing in America, Fannie Mae Foundation, the biggest foundation in the Washington, D.C. area, if I would throw all of that behind the rebuilding of the area next to the campus called LeDroit Park. And the fellow's name was Pat Swigert. I'm still friendly with him. Matter of fact, he's on the board of the African American History and Culture Museum with me. Very good guy. And he said, please say yes. And I said, yes. And so we rebuilt LeDroit Park, largely with Fannie Mae money, right next to Howard University. And when we finished that project, he called me and he said, I want to give you an honorary doctorate. The use of the $1 trillion number in terms of the goal of Fannie Mae of doing mortgages for low and moderate income people is the first time I'm aware of that the word trillion has ever been used in a positive circumstance. And we announced that we would devote so much time, so many resources, so much outreach, so much television expenditures that we would succeed over a period of years, which would make regular reports, in doing $1 trillion of targeted lending. It was a real momentum builder because, first of all, there's nobody in the country or in the world, as far as that goes, who could use a number like that and be serious. That we were so big and so powerful, we could say, we'll get it done. I was approached about being chairman of the Kennedy Center. I was not on the Kennedy Center board, but I was, at Fannie Mae and around town. So Ted Kennedy called me, and I said, Senator, you're so nice to call, what can I do? He said, I'd like to have you come and see me. And I said, fine, I'd love to. So a couple days later, I walked into his office, and he said, I gather there's a good chance that you're going to be chairman of the Kennedy Center. He said, why would you do that? And I said, very simply, because I want to pay tribute to your brother. I said, this is about a national institution that needs to be run right. It's a living memorial to your brother, and somebody else can worry about what goes on stage. And that's not my job. My job is to make the living memorial really something, and to do it in a way that includes everybody. And so I created something then called Performing Arts for Everyone. And we started doing free shuttle service from the subway, and we started having open houses, and then along came the Millennium Stage. So in all honesty, well, I enjoyed the theater and I enjoyed going to things occasionally, but it was more about the institution and the legacy than it was about the stages.
He spent so many years at the Kennedy Center, and they were very productive years, but they were also evolutionary years. Is that the role, the scope, the aspiration of the institution and of the physical facility grew?
What I love about Jim is that he has ideas that come out of what seems like nowhere and seem impossible to achieve. And then you realize, oh my gosh, this is not just brilliant, this has long legs and will have huge impact.
The Kennedy Center is a marvelous monument to President Kennedy. And the reason it's so good is because he did so much for culture and the arts in the brief time he was president, in those 2 years and 10 months and 22 days. But it also had a problem, and the problem was that tickets were expensive. They were necessarily expensive. So Jim made the decision to create something called the Millennium Stage, which still goes on today and which he still helps to fund. And that provides free performances night after night after night in the atrium of the Kennedy Center, so that people who could not otherwise afford to go there, except to walk around but couldn't actually see anything, can do it.
While you would not say that the Kennedy Center is a government institution per se, but goodness knows it's tightly linked to government. And Jim was an ideal center where government and culture could come together in such productive ways.
So Millennium Stage is a concept as well as a place that every single day here at the Kennedy Center at 6 p.m. there is a free concert for whomever wants to come. Most days it takes place in the foyer here, and we have between 350 and 500 people attend. It can be young musicians, it can be visiting international dancers, it can be a poetry slam, it can be rock and roll, it could be a celebration of the Lunar New Year, it can be any kind of performing arts, and it has a home here at the Kennedy Center. It's one of those concepts that arts organizations around the world envy, and we have it built into our DNA here at the Kennedy Center. What a great gift that started out as a germ of an idea and has built into the identity now of the Kennedy Center.
People ask me, what do you do for a living? I've had an answer that I've used for a very long time. I say, I talk for a living. They say, you mean speeches? Honorarium speeches? I said, no, I just go into small rooms and I talk, and then I get paid. So in the course of all this, I started going on to corporate boards. I've done 105 years of corporate board service. I started more and more civic organization work here in Washington, D.C., Brookings Institution I was head of, Kennedy Center I was the head of. So I've had a very mixture of things I've done in my professional life. And it has been enormously rewarding, and I feel like I've been unbelievably blessed.
Jim obviously has incredible leadership capacities, and people have known that for a very long time. I mean, he was very young when he got involved with Walter Mondale, ran Fannie Mae, ran the Kennedy Center, has the Stanford Center on Longevity. He's just a natural leader, and people turn to him, and one of the reasons they turn to him is not just because he's smart, not just because he can get the job done, but because he has a sensitivity to other people, a capacity to measure the talents and utility of people who work with and for him, and a capacity to make a real difference.
The kind of leader I've always wanted to be is somebody who had an underlying realism about what the situation was, who had a sense for innovation and strategy that was original. I guess innovation by definition is original. And who had a concept of how to move people to support, which of course is a lot of what politics is about, but it's also a lot of what business is about. And somebody who was warm enough, personal enough, that people might actually want to follow. I think that leadership is also about followership. If nobody wants to follow, you can't be a good leader. The most interesting thing I was ever told about leadership was by a professor of mine at Princeton named Marvin Bressler. He said, Jim, let me tell you something about leaders. He said, political leaders, business leaders, other kind of leaders, all make a lot of mistakes. He said, do you know who are the ones who survive and thrive? The ones who have the capacity to be forgiven. Because they all make mistakes. And so the capacity to back off and say you were wrong, be forgiven for what you did because you had honest motivation and honest values, so that's the difference.
Jim is dedicated to counseling young people, and I think today he spends a significant amount of time counseling young people about college, about careers, about coping with the complexities of being young.
I met Jim really in the late 1990s. I had certainly followed his career kind of as a young person professionally, and as I began government service, I had followed his career, and so I knew of him, and I knew many people who were good friends of his in this enormous network of friends of Jim. I think I called him up and asked him if he'd mind going to lunch with me, and he did, and then it's now been 18 or 19 years of very close friendship, and as I've had and needed and looked to folks for advice about my family, my kids, the things I care about the most, their education, and really how to help shape their lives. I've imposed on him in many, many times to just share maybe my more innermost ambitions and hopes and aspirations, and ask for advice on how to get there.
I was a little worried. I've been using the word worthwhile a lot, and I think it sounds like maybe I'm the judge of what's worthwhile. I'm the judge of what's worthwhile for me, but it's not a concept I think that generalizes well, because lots of different, just being a good family member, is worthwhile. Being generous is worthwhile. I mean, there's so many people who would give away more money than I do if they had it. And Heather keeps saying to me, she said, you're getting people jobs all day long, you're counseling them on their next step in their careers, you're taking care of their kids, you're getting their kids into college. She said, it's so great that you're doing all this. And then she said in a very nice way, who wouldn't if they could?
Jim is as concerned about the people that don't have anything as anything, and that's kind of been a cornerstone of his career. He's tried to help, whether it's through housing, through various institutions that he's given a lot of money to make a better life for those less fortunate than us. And that's very, very admirable. Not many people in his position do that.
The one thing that I thought was always really special about my dad and was unusual growing up in the house with him is that he was obviously doing all of this really important stuff. So from the time that I was born, when he was 42, very shortly after that he became CEO of Fannie Mae, and every day, every night was this really important, significant work that he was doing. But no matter what was going on in his life, I could always pick up the phone, and I knew that when I called his office, he would drop whatever was going on and pick it up. It was like a very small gesture, but as a kid who was calling to say that I'd had a goal in a soccer game, or I was really excited about something that had happened at school, he would 100% of the time be there for me in a way that was really important and significant for me. His fatherhood to me, his willingness to go over the top for me in so many different ways, in his generosity, in his support for me, in his love for me. I've never had a doubt of that ever in my life. Obviously in his career. He's the kind of guy who decides that something should be better or can be done when other people are saying that it can't, and he'll get it done. He has an ability to execute beyond any that I've ever seen from anybody ever. Growing up in every way possible, my dad was larger than life. I look at photos of myself as a child, and there's an amazing fact that in all of them, I'm actually dressed exactly like him. And when I was a kid, I'm sure that they put me in the same cable knit sweater and polo shirt as he was intentionally. But the funny thing is, as I got older and had the ability to dress and act however I wanted, I kept doing it. And I think what I see in that is that I admired him so much. And I think even in the way that I use my hands when I gesture, or the way that I laugh, people will point out to me that that's like him. And in so many ways, whenever that happens and they say that to me, it makes me proud.
Well, my dad gave me 3, which I'll pass on. Tell the truth, be good at what you do, and never look back.
So one of the unique things about Jim Johnson is that he has lots of friends and relationships in different parts of his life, in different parts of his world. And he is able to figure out how to make connections, from the political world to the social world, from the social world to the business world, from the business world to the educational world. and here in the world of the nonprofit and the performing arts. He is just one of those guys who everybody feels good about being around, and that speaks to what a wonderful person he is. And as a result, great things happen when you pull all these different kinds of people with different backgrounds together to do something, whether it's here at the Kennedy Center or in all the other areas in which Jim is really involved.
One of the things you should know about me is that I have no rear view mirror. I am relentlessly forward looking. And so I never look back. I mean, if somebody asks me to be analytical, I look back and I reflect and so on, but on my average day, it's all forward.
He has an ability, which I call seeing around corners. He can see 3-4 steps ahead before anybody else ever does it. He's a great, great strategic thinker. But what I really like to talk about Jim is friendship. If Webster's dictionary, if you look it up and it says definition of a very good friend, that's Jim Johnson.
He's also a competitor and an aggressive, tough, unyielding competitor.
And in the time that we have been friends in Washington, you taught me one very important thing, and that is that friendship is the medicine of life. And I value our friendship. I am honored by it. I am a better person for it.
One of Jim's great gifts is in pulling people together. And whether it was in an administration or as chief of staff or in his business life at Fannie Mae or in board roles or philanthropy, he sets the table with people of consequence. And when I say consequence, it's not just monetary consequence, but it's individuals with ideas who have impact and who care.
But he's also made a kind of quiet difference in many different ways, in terms of making sure that women at Fannie Mae had the medical services they needed, in making sure that folks in Washington who couldn't afford to buy a $35 or $50 or $100 ticket to an event at the Kennedy Center could actually go there and not just walk around and look at the bust of President Kennedy, but see a show, because he created the Millennium Stage and financed it with his own money.
No matter where it is, so it can be the Four Seasons in Georgetown in DC, it can be the Rustic Moose Cafe in Sun Valley. I think he cares a lot about an idea of community, whatever that community may be, and wants to be a regular and consistent fixture of it.
55 years since I left Benson, and I've been out on the stage, oftentimes a very big one. White House, Fannie Mae, Kennedy Center, Brookings, Goldman Sachs, Target, et cetera, et cetera. I have a platform and a megaphone that is very rare.